Welcome, I said, to our three-part series, to the second part of our three-part series on European magic and its traditions, which is dedicated today to Jewish magic and its connection to the European Renaissance. So you should expect about 1 hour of conversation, between 45 minutes and 1 hour, followed by about 30 minutes for live questions from you, members of the audience. I am, to begin with, honored and pleased to welcome our speakers. First, Professor Moshe Idel of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's a world-renowned scholar of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah who really needs no introduction. Among the numerous groundbreaking work he has authored, one could quote Kabbalah, New Perspective, Kabbalah in Italy, or Absorbing Perfections, Kabbalah and Interpretation. He is joined this evening by Professor Saverio Campanini of the University of Bologna, a leading scholar of Jewish-Christian relations during the Renaissance, who has made significant contribution to our understanding of Kabbalistic traditions in European intellectual history. In particular, he has worked extensively on the Kabbalistic library of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and has published, among others, an edition and translation of the Book of Bahir by Flavius Mithridates, who was Pico's Hebrew teacher and Kabbalistic informer. The conversation is, at this moment, shortly to be introduced and led by Dr. Agata Paluch of the Frei University of Berlin, whose research focuses on Jewish magical and Kabbalistic tradition in early modern Central and Eastern Europe, and to whom I am now handing the microphone.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, so let's begin our discussion about Jewish magic, building on our previous conversation about classical and Christian magical traditions in Europe. And as in our first discussion in the series, we will probably still avoid giving any single definition of what magic was and is today. But even without that one strict definition, it's undeniable that academic studies of Judaism and Jewish history recognize now how Jewish magical traditions and practices were crucial in shaping religious and intellectual discourses, even though scholarly interest in this field has gained this considerable momentum, perhaps only in the recent decades. Jewish magical practices are well and alive today, but they also have deep historical roots. Since antiquity, they have been part and parcel of both intellectual and popular aspects of Israelite and Jewish religion, overlapping and connecting with various other forms of knowledge, natural knowledge, medicine, the arts. We have material evidence of magical practices from the Second Temple period onwards. We have also plentiful textual sources. Rabbinic Judaism took a very nuanced approach to magical practice. Just to mention one example, that of a Talmudic tractate which features a categorization of magic into three types: the forbidden and punishable, forbidden but not punishable, and permitted practice, which already shows the complexity of attitudes towards magic and the distinction between what could be allowed and the various practices of sorcery or simply idolatry during the formation of a religious textual canon. But for our discussion today, we will jump over to focus specifically on Jewish magic in the medieval and early modern Europe. We have, again, plenty of textual evidence showing how Jewish magical knowledge circulated among Jews in pre-modern Europe. The magical practices developed into quite a sophisticated body of knowledge and crossed social boundaries with extensive material evidence that reflect this stage of preservation and transmission across different social classes and Jewish communities. So let's begin with the question of the transmission of Jewish magic, especially the learned magic, from ancient times to medieval Europe. Professor Idel, you have written extensively about Jewish esoteric and also magical traditions on their move to Europe. The medieval period seemed to have diverse interpretations of magic, especially the scholarly one. Could you talk a little bit about these early magical traditions as they were reaching Europe? How did magic interact with other developing intellectual traditions, such as, for instance, mystical pietism, Jewish philosophy, but especially the emergent Kabbalah in Europe. What was the role of magic in shaping these various interpretations of Jewish religion and practice in medieval Europe?
In fact, Jewish magic arrived to Europe from outside Europe. The main traditions of magic in Judaism are stemming from the Middle East, what I should call the more magic of divine names and angelic names and demonic names, which is not related to a certain system of thinking. It was simple, I would say, magic practice by people who didn't have a wider vision, theological or scientific, and that we can see from the early evidence found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even more in the Cairo Gniza, where a lot of magic is found there, which demonstrates that among the Jews, magic was not so problematic as we may imagine. In the 20th century, a lot of more Jewish magic was discovered in magical bowls in Iraq, and have many, many hundreds, to say the least, in which you can see from time to time figures known in history that they resorted to magic. That's also the case in the Talmud, not too much, but we can find examples of magic in the Talmud. This arrived to Europe and informed a lot of discussions in late medieval Jewry in Europe, especially in what is called today Central and Western Europe, or Ashkenazi Europe, Germany, England, France, which adopted a lot of the ancient magic without integrating it in bigger structures, intellectual structures. On the other side, a totally different tradition arrived to Europe from sources which can be called Hellenistic. It can be described as astromagical traditions, which are not so much interested in divine names, but much more in materials, in time, when to do, how to do, what to sacrifice, despite the fact that also linguistic elements are involved. That arrived basically via Arabic sources from the Hellenistic world, wherever. We don't know exactly, but maybe Egypt. Those two traditions flourished since 12th century. And we can hardly understand Judaism without understanding the contribution of the two forms of magic, which were in most of the cases separated, but in many moments they meet and interacted. So the European Jewish magic is not exactly European, but it became very, very European, given the fact that we have a huge literature, which afterwards had an influence also on Italian Renaissance. But the peak of Jewish magic is much later in what is called the Hasidic movement, whose so-called founder was a magician. He was called a magician, Baal Shem. So, in my opinion, it's very difficult to marginalize magic as it had been done in the 19th century and a great part of the 20th century, as if alien to Judaism. In my opinion, that's an important component of Jewish life and literature and ways of thinking or mentality. So, two basically different traditions arrived from outside Europe, flourished in Jewish centers in medieval time, and had an impact on pre-modern and even modern Judaism.
Thank you. And so let's focus perhaps on that component of linguistic magic or the use of divine names. We have in the medieval sources the term practical Kabbalah that starts to be used sometimes as a synonym of magic. At times to avoid these connotations with idolatry or forbidden practice. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that this emergence of this term also reflects a new understanding of other learned traditions in the medieval period, or what can you tell us about this particular development?
In my opinion, linguistic magic is evident even in the Bible. You can find in the Bible a lot of theophoric names. For example, Ishayahu, Yirmiyahu, meaning these theophoric names have a meaning. They are not just random because they are repeated. And in other parts of the Bible, we have an attempt to restrict this form of magic by limiting the use of the divine name. But nevertheless, the divine name was an important sacred tradition deemed to be transmitted by the high priest to others and conceived to be the center of the Jewish ritual in the temple. So that was basically linguistic magic. But in addition to it, we have also other angelic and demonic traditions, and we have books about them. We have commentaries on the Bible attempting to extract those divine names or angelic names from biblical verses. So this substratum is very, very important, meaning it's not an explosion of an alien type of knowledge, but it was found there in one way or another, even in the names of persons. To give you an example, Elijah in Hebrew, Eliyahu is two divine names. He's a very important figure. That cannot be a matter of random. So, in my opinion, there's a substratum of what happened in biblical times. Afterwards, we see it in the Qumran literature, and more in the Cairo Gniza, and in the bowls from Iraq, there's literatures which still wait to be published and researched.
Thank you. And I want to also still bring you towards the later period. You worked extensively on this intersection of Kabbalah and magical practice as well in various Ashkenazi and Spanish contexts. And I wanted to still go in the direction of the divine names and the use of divine names. Practical Kabbalah was primarily concerned with the use of the divine names for material or utilitarian purposes. However, the approach of practical Kabbalists, at least in the medieval period and later on in the early modern period, the Balei Shem, the masters of the divine names, was often challenged by authorities, both Ashkenazi, Spanish. For instance, Abraham Abulafia, on whom you worked extensively, developed a particularly nuanced approach to the practical use of divine names. So can you tell us just a little bit what drove these different approaches towards the uses of the divine name as the Kabbalistic and other esoteric traditions were growing?
In fact, the earliest evidence for the use of the term Kabbalah as an esoteric tradition has to do with divine names. That is found long before the historical Kabbalah. It's found in late medieval, but before the emergence of Kabbalah. So that is found in Iraq of today, that's found in Ashkenaz. Assumptions of the divine name are the core of a certain form of worship. And we have a ritual of a transmission of the divine name. Abulafia was strongly influenced by it, but he neutralized the magical aspect because he was very Maimonidean. And Maimonides didn't like magic and didn't like discussions of divine names. So he came out of a tradition, basically Ashkenazi tradition, where divine names are used for magical purposes. However, faithful as he attempted to be to Maimonides, he neutralized the magical aspect and he attempted to apply it to a certain technique of inner changes. So the divine names are supposed in various ways, combined with other aspects of the technique, to change the human intellect. So he won't call it magic, he will protest. And he attacked the magicians. Nevertheless, it's quite evident that he was acquainted with it. And he extracted from there what he believed is going to be helpful for him. Later on, magic entered very deeply in Kabbalah, including followers of Abulafia, including. And then, toward the end of the 13th century, we have the term practical Kabbalah, which is not exactly a good term, because in my opinion, also the speculative Kabbalah has magical aspects. But the term practical Kabbalah became more and more attractive for people who couldn't study all those systems of the Kabbalists. So with the time, we have more and more material, part of it investigated by Agata, of what is called practical Kabbalah, which moves more and more to the center. It's not something at the corner. Israel Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidus, he was called by everyone the master of the divine name. Also, his opponents won't deny the power of divine names. They may use it or not, but that's another story. So the practical Kabbalah became more and more important and had a vigorous impact, not only in the Ashkenazi institution of Baalei Shem, but also in Northern Africa. So that became widespread in Judaism that we can see today. In many places, centers of Judaism, you can see this magical inclination in a variety of forms.
Thank you. let's move towards the 15th century, as it seems there is a significant shift in the approach to the learned magic that emerges towards the end of that century. And this transformation could be attributed to various factors, historical events, so particularly the expulsion of Jews from Spain and the spread of ideas across the Mediterranean, and the intellectual ferment that was brewing in the Italian peninsula, especially Florence. So let's start with that context. The Florentine circles made significant efforts to theoretically map the forms of magic and assimilate knowledge of theurgy and magic from Jewish sources through major translation projects. Saverio, you studied extensively this topic. Could you guide us through the understandings of Jewish magic in late 15th century Florence and the sources behind the Christian appreciation of Jewish magic?
Yeah, well, the importance of magic for the Italian Renaissance, for the 15th century humanists, has been already well studied, and I would say mostly due to pioneering work of many members of the Warburg Institute. I think of Daniel Pickering Walker and, of course, Dame Frances Yates. There's also an Italian contribution specifically to this study, and I just remember Eugenio Garin, but also Vittorio Perrone Compagni and Paola Zambelli. Nowadays, we are starting to see that even if the field is already well studied, there are still things we don't know, or we don't know enough. For example, the Jewish influence precisely on Marsilio Ficino. So Marsilio Ficino is a key figure in the development of a specifically Neoplatonic Renaissance, comprising also theurgic and magic practices. He was, of course, a reader of Proclus. He was, of course, a reader of Iamblichus. But now, due to the studies of Franco Bacchelli, Stéphane Toussaint, and very recently of Guido Bartolucci, there is new evidence from the manuscripts that he was aware of specific Jewish traditions, and he was speaking about the Kabbalists, the doctrine of reincarnation, and he was experimenting with perfumes, with amulets, with talismans, and so there is definitely also a Jewish component in his formation. But certainly the most and the best known figure among the Florentine, so to speak, Christian Kabbalists or people interested in Jewish magic, there is, of course, Pico della Mirandola. And nevertheless, there are other figures belonging to his milieu, also in Florence, for example, Pierleone da Spoleto, who has been only recently rediscovered as very well informed about Jewish magic. He had at his disposal vernacular translations, sometimes written in a very strange mixture of Italian or Sicilian and Spanish, so probably from Jews coming from Spain and somehow learning also Italian, of Kabbalistic or magic, and sometimes only magic treatises. And another figure we start now to rediscover is certainly Antonio Flaminio Biaxander. I had the opportunity to make a survey of his library, of the preserved books belonging to his library, both incunables, printed books, and especially manuscripts, some of them in Arabic. And the collection is stunning. It's more than 50 books. And more than half of this collection are magical or Kabbalistic books. It's very interesting to study his glosses because he notes precisely the magic formulae and even translates the term, for example, oyevim, hostes or enemies, So in order to qualify in a very technical sense how we could probably use these formulae. So it's not just about theory, but let me underline a point, which is for me of great importance, perhaps also useful for the further discussion. What did the Christians do with the Jewish magic? So for sure they were aware of it, increasingly aware of it. They had the translations of texts, for example, and I will come back to that probably later. Flavius Mithridates translated the Mishimushe Torah, so an outspoken magic treatise about extracting divine names from biblical verses, as Moshe was saying before. And he translated that for Pico della Miranda. But the question is, once you have the basic distinction, white magic, black magic. So let's say black magic is forbidden. We don't want to have to do anything to do with that. It's demonic. It's forbidden. So from a Christian point of view, there's still white magic. But this does not seem to be enough. The evidence of the sources seem to point to a further distinction between theory and practice. So theory seems to be allowed in the way that magic can be understood as a theory of magic or a theory of the workings of the world. This is quite clear in Pico della Mirandola. He is alluding to magic as a science, as a theoretical corpus of ideas that can help him to understand the world and how it works. But there is almost no mention of a practical usage of these ideas. So very early on, among Christians, there's the idea that Jewish magic can be good, but only as a theoretical framework to understand nature.
Thank you. And at the same time, there is a growing interest as well in the Jewish intellectual circles in Renaissance Florence in developing theoretical aspects of magic. And Moshe, you worked a lot also on Johann Alemanno, and you distinguish this specific magical Kabbalah. Could you explain a little bit of what made this type of Kabbalah magical? And what accounts for this parallel emergence of magical interpretations among both the Jewish and Christian intellectual circles in Renaissance Florence?
Yohanan Alemanno was a figure who flourished at the end of the 15th century. He was of Ashkenazi origins, the name Alemanno. And he knew a lot about Ashkenazi magic, had books. But what seems to me to be important is that he offered a certain type of curriculum. What to study when. On the top of the curriculum, after the study of Kabbalah, after the study of Abulafia, he recommends to study magic. So he was one of the mentors of Piccola Mirandola, at least for a while. And in his books, we can find Ashkenazi magic of divine names, and also astromagical discussions that he would say that someone who knows qualities of the words can attract in the prayer supernal powers, astral powers. And that's one of the explanations why prayer is working. And also why the study of Torah in another discussion. Meaning the assumption is there are occult qualities in letters, better to say sounds, and supernal powers. So when you know how to manipulate, you can attract powers in accordance to what you want. So for him, that's an explanation of prayer and also the study of the Torah. So that's a magical vision of Judaism, which combines a lot of different traditions. But it is interesting that that emerged parallel to Ficino and Pico. I don't say there is no relationship. It's a very difficult question. But it is fascinating that Alemanno has sources. Not all of them were translated or known. So his vision of the universe was speaking about someone, a very learned figure, very erudite. Nevertheless, for him, magic is something natural.
Thank you. So is the synthesis of Kabbalah and magic, for instance, that embraced by Alemanno indeed idiosyncratic, or whether we could assume that this form of thinking would be exerting somewhat a more lasting impact on the understanding of Jewish esoteric and magical lore by Christian thinkers as well? Saverio, if you'd like to reflect here on that topic, or maybe move on also to the generally to the afterlife of Pico's library, perhaps up to the 16th and 17th century.
Yeah.
With
Just a short comment on Alemanno, as Moshe
right.
said already. We know when Alemanno met Pico, and that's after the publication of the conclusions, which is a very interesting point, because in the conclusions, in the thesis, in the famous 900 thesis on everything knowable and on Kabbalah, Pico already coupled magic and Kabbalah. He said, no science can make us more certain of the divinity of Christ than Kabbalah and magic. So in this order, Kabbalah et Magia. Meaning that I'm not suggesting that Alemanno was influenced by Pico. It could very well be. But anyway, because the thesis he was trying to demonstrate would not be liked by Alemanno, but certainly the idea of coupling Kabbalah and magic was already present in Pico, and we must say that his teacher, Mithridates, was certainly very, very well knowledgeable in Kabbalah. He already working for Federico da Montefeltro in Urbino. He copied an amulet, a magical square, saying that his father used to make it of gold and put it into cotton in a certain recipient and using perfumes in order to ease birth. So his father was already a magician. And he has geomantic treatises among his preserved books in Germany and in Italy, in Rome and in Munich. And I already said he translated the Shimushe Torah, and in a gloss, he even made fun of Pier Leone da Spoleto, saying, I have learned that Pier Leone does not want to give you some books, probably magical books. And he says, don't worry. If you tell me to, I have means to force him to do it. And it's not about, blackmailing him. He says, you know Mithridates, so you know me. I am capable of doing what I say. So he's clearly alluding to magical conjurations in order to force the will of another person. This is Pico's master. So in his world, there was this usage of magic in everyday life. But of course, Mithridates was a convert. As to the question I was already raising before, take just the golem. The golem is known to all these Christian Kabbalists or Christian magicians or Christian, let's say, practicing or theoretically speculative people. Reuchlin talks about the golem and knows a certain book. He calls this book Sefer Akdama, or Akadma, which is Hakdama to a Kabbalistic treatise of the Sefer Yun circle, with a story of a creation of a golem, and the golem cancels himself. The Aleph letter and gives birth to the formula God tetragram dead. So this formula was, of course, appealing for Christians. But Reuchlin at no place is talking about trying himself to do a golem, to make a golem. And the same applies to Pier Leone. He had the same text 20 or 30 years earlier, and he has no gloss or commentary in saying, I tried a golem and I succeeded. There's nothing of this sort. He was knowledgeable about that. And even Ludovico Lazzarelli, he is also a Hermetic prophet or a Hermetic herald of the prophet Mercurio da Correggio. In his printed works mentions the golem. And again, what did he do with that? He tries to spiritualize the golem. So as Moshe was saying about Abulafia, trying to transform magic from operating in the world into operating within the self, I have the impression that these reflections on the golem were not practical in nature, or not practical in the sense that they were trying to transform the world. They were trying to understand it. So they were trying to change their minds more than the world around them. I would just, and that would be my last comment on your question, Agata. What about the general attitude of the Christians about Jewish magic? And here I have to say that magic was certainly there also to reinstate, to reinforce prejudices that the Christians had about the Jews. The Jews were forced to do magic because they were abandoned by God. So they were forced to do magic not because they were powerful, but because they were impotent. Their power ceased refusing Christ, and that's why they were forced to an inferior form of religion. So that was the classical understanding of magic as superstition. And you have that in many, many authors admitting that there is something as Jewish magic, but condemning it as the proof that the Jews are far away from God, and that their prayers, as simple prayers, are not efficient. They will not bring the desired result. That's why they have to recur to the demons, to the devil, in order to, like Trachtenberg's book, they have to use magic because they have no religion. And this is a classical view of magic as the religion of the other. This would be my statement about that. Magic as perceived as superstition because it's the religion, the other one, the person who is not right practicing it. But still, this does not bring the Christians just to refuse absolutely and utterly Jewish magic. As if, I would say, as if some sort of coals still burning from the destroyed temple were there is something about the Jews that is still powerful. And the Christians are attracted to it, like a distant memory of a past glory, the splendor of Jerusalem. I don't know how to say it otherwise. Just something is still there. And this something is still efficient, is still bringing results. And otherwise, I would not be able to explain why so many Christian authors, for example, Francesco Zorzi, would even dedicate an entire section of his last book, the Problemata, in 1536, to the theory of magic, saying that the theory of, it's not the theory of reality like in Pico, but the theory of magic. How does magic work? And he says, if you want to know how magic works, you need to know Kabbalah. So Kabbalah is the theory of magic. And if you want to know Kabbalah, you just need to read one book, the Zohar. So the Zohar, which is funny because the Zohar is a theurgic work, but is a theosophic word, and not necessarily a theurgic one. But he reads the Zohar as the theory underlying Kabbalah, allowing magic to work. And he seems to be convinced that Jewish rituals work. Like, for example, deciding with which hand you should wash first. With hand should wash the other one. And it's the practice of the Jews is one, but the Kabbalah says it's another one. And he explains why is that. So he tries to really understand the ritual aspect of Judaism. And never in any place he denies the value, the power of practice, of the Jewish practice. A very paradoxical example, and then I'm done. It's Jacques Gaffarel. It's very well known. He writes in the 17th century. He writes a letter to Leone Modena, who had written the Riti degli Ebrei, the apology or apologetic view of Judaism as a perfectly rational and sociable religion. And he says, you forgot magic. Magic is a central component of Judaism, but he's not polemical. He's not polemical. He is perhaps a little bit smirky, but he is not polemical. He's not trying to say, Modena, you have forgotten to say or to admit that Judaism is a superstition. Quite on the contrary, he says it has an invaluable, it's very important from a, let's say, archaeological or antiquarian point of view, that you explain us the rituals you are making, like sewing the mouth of a dead person. This is very important. We have to, we can learn magic, and we can learn the history of magic, because you are the living testimony of ancient magic still among us. So he wants to, he sees Modena like a Phoenician, I don't know, like an ancient man. So the Jews are remnants of antiquity, and suddenly for Gaffarel, this is positive. This is a good thing. So it's, but Modena was, knew Inquisition very well and was terrorized and obsessed to end up in jail, and that's why he refused to say anything about magical aspects of Judaism. He would say, yeah, some Jews do it, but not the Italian Jews, or not in Venice, or not in my synagogue. So, restricting the field and saying, not me, I've never heard, never seen, just to defend himself. So in the end, the influence of Jewish magic and the presence of Jewish magic is very relevant from the Renaissance onward, but the judgment about it deformed in a way the perception of Jewish magic in saying it's ancient, it's superstition, or it's interesting historically. So once again, what is missing is the practice. Even Zorzi just describes the practice and would never admit he was doing it. But we know from other documents, for example, the dealings with the nun Chiara Bugni, who had visions and even materialization of objects like a rose made of steel in her cell, in her monastery. He was also dabbling with magic. So he was also trying, for example, to drink a liquid that materialized in the cell, and he was trying to give it to a nephew to cure him from a sickness. So, he was really doing it, but in his works, you would never find anything like, I tried it and it works.
Thank you. And speaking about this long life of Jewish magical traditions, Moshe, you already mentioned Hasidism today. And let's talk a little bit about what you describe as a mystical magical model. You place it alongside the theosophical, theological, and ecstatic models as one of the main frameworks to understand Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and later on Hasidism as well. What do you consider the most influential of the forms of this learned magic as we go towards the early modern and modern periods, particularly in the relationship to later Hasidic movements?
I would say that magic was practiced in more popular forms, but we have a variety of concatenations between magic and Kabbalah, which means that in order to be able to use magic, you must know the structure of the universe, the structure of divinity, and then you are capable to manipulate. That we find, in my opinion, in a very clear way in one of the most important masters of Kabbalah ever, Rabbi Moses Cordovero, who wrote a huge introduction to Kabbalah, and the last chapter, speaking about prayer, is magical. So that's what I call the mystical magical, meaning you must be able to elevate by knowledge and by emotional performance, to cleave to the divine world, and then you can manipulate. Meaning that's not something totally new, but it became more important in Kabbalah since the Safedian Kabbalah. And in my opinion, in Hasidism, this model of a mystical aspect which precedes the magical aspect became very, very important. So the founder of Hasidism can be considered to be a mystic. He wouldn't protest. He wouldn't protest also, would he be described as a magician? But his account would be that he combines the two. The mystical is during the prayer, someone is divesting himself of materiality and arrives in a state of mind or soul that he can cleave to the divine and bring down divine power and impart this power to his community. That seems to me to be the core of Hasidic practice. I don't say that it worked or didn't work, but socially, for sure it worked. We can see that the institution of the tzaddik is someone who can attain mystical states of mind and also work as a magician. It's very, very important from the beginning of Hasidism up to today. And that is the mystical, magical model that allows a higher type of activity, the mystical, without denigrating the magical aspect, which is important from the social point of view. Magic became, in fact, part of the structure of the Hasidic society up to today. That's from the beginning up to today. I don't say that every Hasidic school, but in general, it seems to me to be true, that the belief that the divine man, the tzaddik, can help you is crucial for the understanding of the emergence and the development of Hasidism up to today.
And speaking about today, we have our final 10 minutes, and I wanted to address the questions of the modern academic study of Jewish magic. And I'd like to begin with Gershom Scholem, who is widely acknowledged as the father of the modern academic study of Jewish mysticism and of Kabbalah, and whose attitude also to Jewish magic was very nuanced and often ambiguous, much like his relationship with Abi Warburg and the Warburg Circle. Scholem and the Warburg Circle had common interest in esoteric traditions, particularly magic and the occult, and it appears that Scholem's early scholarly work in these areas could have been, at least to some extent, influenced by the Warburg Circle. Perhaps in his article on alchemy and Kabbalah, or his early work on Sefer Hatama, or his work on physiognomy. But despite this intellectual alignment, it seems that Scholem and Warburg Circle's relationship was continuously complicated. So perhaps, Saverio, could you tell us a little bit about what were these underlying factors that led to this complex and sometimes very strained relationship between these two scholarly circles?
Well, it's a very interesting question. The beginning of Scholem's academic career, his edition of the Bahir, or the translation, the German translation commentary of the Bahir, started already under the star of or constellation of a Warburgian type, because it was published by Robert Eisler. And Robert Eisler was in contact with Abi Warburg and gave a lecture in Hamburg in 1924. And it was the only lecture that was applauded. There was really a clapping of the hands, which was not normal in Hamburg. Not even Cassirer had been saluted with a hands. So then it was published, and it was a lecture, and the book resulting from this lecture had 450 pages. So you can understand the type of man, Robert Eisler. But yet Warburg, in his correspondence, termed Eisler as a bluff in grand style. So he was not really keen, and he didn't really like him. When Scholem tried many times to have a relationship and a contact with the Warburg Institute, and the Institute itself tried many times to come into contact with him. For example, in the 20s, in 1927, Scholem was already in Palestine, went specifically to Jerusalem, couldn't meet Warburg because Warburg was hospitalized at the time, but he met Fritz Sachsel. And with Sachsel, the relationship was already strained because Scholem had the impression that Sachsel was not honest towards his own Jewish past or Jewish roots, and especially towards his Zionist past. In 1919, Sachsel was a Zionist, and then it was not anymore. But there were many episodes in the 30s when the journal of the Warburg Institute was founded. Scholem promised an article about Reuchlin's sources and then never delivered it. And he published it elsewhere. Again, Scholem went to the Warburg Institute 2 times for a long period in 1954 and then again in 1960 for a whole term, for a whole year. Actually, he was there writing his book Ursprung und Anfänge der Kabbalah, which was not published under the aegis of the Warburg Institute, but in Germany at the Greuter. So you know perfectly that Scholem qualified the Warburg group, not so specifically the person, as one of the 3 most prominent Jewish sects in the 20th century. And it's interesting to recall the other 2. There were the Institute for Social Research, so Adorno and especially Horkheimer, on the one hand, and Oscar Goldberg and his acolytes, his adepts. So Oscar Goldberg was really a Jewish magician, or pretended to be one, and published 2 books about magic, the magic in the Pentateuch and the magic of the ancient Hebrews and the temple as a magic device. So really a magician. So the question would be, was there a relationship between the 3 sects, or was just a dislike of Scholem? I think magic was the connection. Magic, in the case of Goldberg, is clear. In the case of Warburg, what magic was at the center of his idea of survival. Superstition is another name for survival. So it was animating his research in the figurative arts about the survival of themes and topics that survive even against the will or against the theory, and still are there. Motives that survive, and they make the fiber of culture. And in the case of Adorno and Horkheimer, it would be more difficult to say that they were magicians, but Scholem perceived them as such. And it was Hans Blumenberg who noticed that, and saying Scholem is irritated and does not understand fully what the Frankfurt or New York School of Social Research is doing, because they are using all the time the magic, not the magic wand, but the magic dialectical broom. So they are all the time changing things, and they are trying to keep together a Marxist upbringing or a Marxist root in a post-Marxian world. So they are perceived by Scholem as magicians. And the funny thing is that they were reproaching Walter Benjamin, of being too magical, of being too inclined to magic. So magic becomes like a catchword. And why should it be that Scholem did not like magic? He was, after all, collecting magical works, was calling his cat Beliar, so with a magical name or a demonic name. And he was publishing extensively on magic. You recall that, for example, for the Sefer Tamar, he had a photocopy from Warburg himself to complete his edition. So they were in contact with that. And Warburg very ironically said, I hope that your publication will not become a sarcophagus, will not become a new place to hide a book that was hidden for so many centuries. And he replied to that in a letter, which is now even online. Read it. I think, in my opinion, but Moshe can, of course, disagree. In my opinion, Sholem was suspicious of the international character of magic. The fact that the Jewish magic is actually magic. So the Jewish, like Jewish mathematics, it doesn't make sense. It's just, a science which is international, which is fluid, which is going everywhere and penetrating different cultural milieus, as Moshe was pointing out before, coming from Hellenism through Egypt, in Arabic, and then into Hebrew, and becoming Jewish just because some Jews were practicing it is not Jewish enough for Sholem. Sholem was trying also to revive something, but not magic. He was trying to revive the authentic Jewish tradition, and Zionism was the political frame within which he wanted to reconstruct what is genuinely Jewish. And magic was too international for him, not national enough. So that was his preoccupation, and that's why, quite maliciously, he says the only two Jews that were in contact with the Warburg Institute and they were friends to me were somehow connected to conversion. One was Alphonse Barbe, who was librarian at the Warburg Institute and became a Catholic. Or he says even more scornfully, he says, one day he woke up Catholics, just he woke up. So he became a Catholic without noticing somehow. That's the malicious view of Sholem. But we should not only laugh about that joke, it means he was concerned that magic could lead astray. So he had a very clear path, and the very clear path excluded sympathy for the other, let us say. But still, Warburg and Sholem were very much united by the idea of survival. They only had two different angles on the same topic: the survival, how to survive after the catastrophe. Both were concerned with that.
Moshe, would you like to add anything to the intellectual legacies of Warburg and Sholem here, maybe also for the study of the subject of Jewish magic and perhaps also Jewish mysticism today? Moshe?
I would say that magic interested Sholem very much, and he printed important studies. Nevertheless, magic was not integrated in the main line of the development of Kabbalah according to Sholem. The main line is related to Messianism. That is the real power beyond the impact of Kabbalah on Jewish history. So he emulated, in fact, the Messianic vector as the most productive, in his opinion, for understanding the history of Jewish history, not just Kabbalah, of Jewish history. So magic is interfering a little bit with this very strong historical scheme. And that's why he wouldn't discuss in Safed, for example, magic in Safed, which is a lot. And later on, in Hasidus, he was interested in the more pure type of mysticism, despite the fact he says time and again, Israel Baal Shem Tov was a magician. But that is one story. And the other story is, what is the picture the Sholem would like to convey of the history of Kabbalah? And here, he removed not only magic, he removed even Abulafia. That I am going to write about it. Abulafia doesn't exist in his book on Sabbatai Tzvi. entitled The Mystical Messiah. Abulafia was a mystical Messiah. It writes 70 pages about introduction without Abulafia, because that doesn't fit the major vector of his development. If you're going to read also another book of Sholem, The Messianic Idea in Judaism, Abulafia was a Messiah and declared himself Messiah and wrote as a Messiah. He doesn't exist there. So Sholem had a vision of history that he didn't want to be disturbed either by magic or by ecstasy. He wanted to have the messianic vector at the center, and that was accepted not only by Sholem for sure, but by his students and by Jewish historians. That is the real explanation of Judaism, the messianic power that is moving the history.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time, and now we can perhaps collect some questions from the audience.
That's right. Thank you very much for this fitting conclusion. And I would invite you to send me your question through the chat, and then I will convey them to our speakers. Or alternatively, if you want to speak directly, you can use the raised hand option, and then I will ask you to unmute, and you can you can put your questions forward. Let's wait perhaps for questions, or perhaps Agata, you want to ask more things while we're waiting.
Well, in the meantime, perhaps I can, if we still have a few minutes, we can also talk about the study of Jewish magic today after Sholem. And I was curious about Moshe's opinion on that, because as I was reading in his article that Moshe published in 1997, Judaism, Jewish Mysticism and Magic, Moshe, you wrote there, you noted the move of scholarship from higher culture as the main focus of academic research towards the greater emphasis on popular culture, or from the examination of what you called structured ways of thinking to the less articulated ways of experience, from mind to emotion and body. And then also you compared in a footnote this direction of study or development of studies to your own academic career, where you started your PhD in Jewish philosophy, then you ended with a dissertation on Kabbalah, and then you became more and more interested in magical aspects of Jewish religion. And I wonder, looking back at this observation, how do you consider the field's development today?
We have a lot of studies of Jewish magic today, more than ever. I believe in the last 20th century, Jewish magic was studied more than anything written beforehand. Gideon Bohak, Yuval Harari, you yourself, and many others are making a life of studying Jewish magic. So from this point of view, it's evident that the amount of the material was not explored is so great, and people are looking for new material. So magic is emerging now as a subject of study more than I imagined in 1994, in fact, when I wrote. And I wouldn't believe that so many students, scholars are going to write about it. But that is due to the fact that there is new material. You can imagine that after the war from Iraq, a lot of magical bowls emerged, not printed up to today, meaning there's a whole literature. And there are people studying it in England and United States, meaning that is for sure a new domain which is very fruitful and offering new vistas about Judaism.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have a question now to the chat. Perhaps a difficult question. How did the Jewish idea of the golem have an impact on Western science? Is the
Look,
question.
I can offer a very simple question answer.
Yes.
The founder of cybernetics wrote a book entitled
Mhm.
God and Golem Incorporated. That is the first book of cybernetics. Believe me that a lot of people are professors of cybernetics attempt to learn from me about cybernetics, which is stupid. I can show you books. They bring me their books. The golem was a very well-established issue in Judaism. And when the idea of the artificial, and that is the issue, artificial production emerged, the golem was naturally interrogated in this direction, including the guy who wrote the first book of cybernetics, and that's found in the title. Not that he knew too much about the golem, he didn't know too much, but he knew enough in order to put it on the title of the book. Since then, I have here a lot of books written last years of people who are sending the books as if I can help them. Unfortunately, I cannot.
Okay, thank you very much.
One can add that Scholem himself alluded to the golem legend in naming the first computer in Rehovot. He called it Golem Aleph. So the first golem, and he blessed the machine, the calculator, in the 50s. He blessed the machine in saying, go and do not destroy the world. So he seemed to be preoccupied. He seemed to be already anguished by our same preoccupations about artificial intelligence. Since a computer is a hardware, so clay, and a string or a list of letters, words, or bits. So he was understanding very well the workings of the idea and called it Golem Aleph. I made a joke about it. If you anagram Golem Aleph, you obtain Goelam, so their redeemer, but it's only a hope.
I see. Oh, okay, one more question. Well, I have one first question for you, Saverio. When you speak, I read your article about Scholem and the Warburg, and I'm quite struck that the Warburgian with whom Scholem seems to have the best connection is the one who ended up quite excluded and disliked from the Institute from the 50s onwards, that is Edgar Wind. Do you have any comments on the relationship between Scholem and Wind, which seems to have been unusually cordial between him and Warburgian?
Yes, well, I don't have lots of evidence about that, but there is an episode which is very well known. It's also part of the academic gossip, if you want,
Mhm.
about the anonymous review
Ah,
of
yeah.
Brick's biography, intellectual biography of Abi Warburg, which was certainly written by Wind and was published posthumously in his own works, so the family knew about it. And about this, we have letters, even between Scholem and Gombrich. Scholem didn't really like Gombrich's approach, and Gombrich wrote to him, excusing himself for having excluded many topics that would have been of interest for Scholem, not only about let's say magic or magical ideas or Kabbalistic curiosities of Warburg, but also about episodes of censorship. Like there is a painting depicting a castration, and Warburg didn't want to have it published. And Gombrich said, the family forbade me to talk about this episode and wrote to Sholem in excusing himself and saying, "You are right, the demonic part of or the demonic dimension of Warburg's soul comes really too short in this book, and you're right." So the reason of the relationship, the complicity even between Sholem and Wind seems to be certain. We have to search it, or we have to look for it in the hostility to Gombrich. The too well groomed pacified portray of Warburg, excluding the demonic aspect, the deeply irrational, and I would even say Nietzschean side of Warburg's culture. That was too much evened up in Gombrich's biography, and so for that reason, Sholem was telling everybody in private letters that was Edgar Wind, so a very intelligent person who destroyed Gombrich's box. So he was participating to a kind of, let's say, Londonian gossip, even if he was based in Jerusalem. So as if he was really a member of the Warburg Institute, and he was already, battling Gombrich from within, let's say. But I would say that intellectually, there were not many points of contact between the two. The rationalist approach of Wind does not really fit to Scholem's approach. But it's true that in some later articles of Wind about the Florentine Neoplatonist milieu, then I would say that Scholem could and would read them with great pleasure and with consent.
Thank you. We have a few more questions in the chat. Well, one, in fact, is still about Warburg. From Leonardo Rodriguez. Professor Campanini mentioned that for Warburg, superstition is another name for Nachleben. Is it possible to connect the concept of Nachleben to a messianic impulsion in Warburg as well? I personally don't think so, but I should leave the expert to answer.
I do not know of any reflection in this direction. Actually, the mental constitution of Warburg, if I can use such an expression, was rather anti-messianic. The idea is there is no other world in which we can look for salvation. For him, even psychologically, the catastrophe of the First World War was a very, very tough nut to crack, because he was convinced that Germany was his place, and even if he spiritually felt in Florence at home and a Jew by birth, he felt completely identified with Germany. So, according to the reformed perspective of German Judaism, any allusion to messianism or to going back to the land of the fathers had to be silenced. So only on a very much deeper level we could think of messianic hints in Warburg, but not on the surface. I don't see it.
Yes, no, I totally agree. We have a couple more questions. One which which you three can answer to, if you like. Can you please, from Panthea Loftian, can you please say something about the role of alchemy on Kabbalah, or the other way around? The role of alchemy on Kabbalah, or Kabbalah on alchemy, and it brings to mind the idea of a spiritual alchemy as a mental process. But again, I'm listening to you.
Well, if I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but there's again by Scholem a very famous bon mot, a sentence he said once. Most of the books of Kabbalah in the early modern era have the word. Most of the books of alchemy in the early modern bear the word Kabbalah in the title, but that's only because Kabbalah is only there. So Kabbalah is not in the box, but just on the title page. So they are called Opus Kabbalisticum Magnum, but they do not they do not contain anything Kabbalistic or anything seriously Kabbalistic. Sholem was collecting books bearing the word Kabbalah in the title and not dealing with Kabbalah. So it was like a negative library, like the book by Thornton Wilder, Kabbalah. So there are many pseudo-Kabbalistic books, and he was interested in them. And he even wrote a famous article, Hashemian Kabbalah, in the 20s, and then again in the 70s. But this in Eranos. But this is somehow like a misunderstanding. The relationship between Kabbalah and alchemy is a tenuous one, to say the most. But it's true that the Esh Metzaref, a book about alchemy, is contained in the Kabbalah Denudata and was perhaps the most interesting for Isaac Newton. Newton was looking forward, was really eager to get hold of the second volume of the Kabbalah Denudata when it was published in Frankfurt, and he wanted especially to read the Esh Metzaref, so this Kabbalistic book. There's, and I'm finished. There's only one episode where alchemy and Kabbalah are strangely mixed, and it's very early in the 1510s of the 16th century in Venice. A book called Vohar Kadumia was published, and there it is stated this book is against alchemy. So it's a polemical book against alchemy, but it's actually an alchemical book where everything is coded with Hebrew letters. So the information about mercury and all other metals are coded with the Hebrew letters, so that the secret of alchemy would be tzeruf, so combination or letter combinations would be the ultimate alchemy, the alchemy of the Hebrew alphabet. So this is a very strange and anomalous Kabbalistic book, alchemic book, but it's at the very beginning of the history of printing about alchemy. It has a strange Kabbalistic connection. So it's not excluded at all, but it's rather marginal. But perhaps you, Agata, have more to say about alchemy and Kabbalah.
Not really. Okay. One perhaps last question. It goes like this from Bros Norel. If you want to learn about magic, do you need to start to learn about Kabbalah? Or in fact, if you learn Kabbalah, will you necessarily learn magic? Perhaps you can comment, and I think that might be a way to wrap up about Kabbalah and magic. If you want to learn about magic, do you need to start with Kabbalah?
I would recommend to try the two ways. To study magic, to study Kabbalah, and then to see what is helpful. After reading the first 100 books on the topic, we'll discuss later.